You made it. Not in the way you imagined when you were younger, maybe, but by almost any reasonable measure. You made it. You have income, you have a home, or you're working toward one. You take vacations, you can cover emergencies without complete collapse. You're not living paycheck to paycheck the way you feared you might be. And yet, strangely, the more you've earned, the less behind you sometimes feel. That's not a complaint. It's not ingratitude. It's something more specific than either of those things. Because if you're honest, and you are, that's why you're here, the better you've done financially, the less settled you feel about it. The ceiling of enough keeps moving, and you keep moving with it, wondering why the ground beneath you never quite feels solid. That gap between what you know to be true about your financial life and what you actually feel about it is not random. It has a mechanism. And that's exactly what this is about. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. The feeling I just described is not a character flaw. It's not immaturity. It's not evidence that you're ungrateful or somehow broken. People who feel this way are not, generally speaking, reckless. They are not irresponsible. They are not people who haven't tried. You are probably someone who thinks carefully about money, who has read things, researched things, maybe tracked spending at some point, or tried to get serious about investing. You've had real conversations with yourself, honest ones, about where you want to be and whether you're on track. You are self-aware enough to notice the gap. And honestly, that self-awareness is one of the things that makes this so hard. Because the people who feel this most acutely are not the people who are failing. They're the people who are watching themselves carefully, who have enough perspective to compare where they are to where they think they should be, who are paying attention. And that attention, that clarity, that intelligence doesn't protect you from this feeling. It almost makes it worse. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it runs against what most people assume. Most of us believe that awareness is protection, that if you understand what's happening, you're insulated from it. But that's not quite how it works here. What you've built is real. What you've done takes effort. And the discomfort you feel when you look at it and still don't feel satisfied, that discomfort is not irrational. It has a cause, a specific, identifiable cause, and it has almost nothing to do with your bank balance. Here's what's actually happening. Your brain is not evaluating your financial life in any kind of absolute sense. It never has been. It doesn't look at your net worth or your savings rate or your income and render a judgment based on those numbers in isolation. What it does, what it's always done, is compare. Constantly, automatically, without your permission, and often without your awareness. It compares what you have to what the people around you have, what you earn to what your peers earn, where you live to where people like you seem to live, what your life looks like against what you've come to understand a life like yours is supposed to look like. And the moment that comparison produces a gap, the moment you land on what feels like the lesser side of it, the sense of enough evaporates, instantly, completely. This is the comparison trap. But I want to be precise here, because this isn't simply about envy, and calling it that misses most of what's actually happening. Envy is wanting what someone else has. This is different. This is comparison operating at the level of identity. It's your sense of who you are, where you stand, what your life says about you, being quietly measured against a standard you didn't consciously choose, a standard that is always moving. And it's particularly effective on people who are doing reasonably well, because the people who are genuinely struggling have a more concrete problem to solve. They're focused on the immediate. But when you're okay,
When the basic pressures are managed, your brain has the bandwidth to zoom out, to look around, to notice where you stand relative to others in your world. Your world used to be your neighborhood, your extended family, your colleagues at work, maybe 100, 150 people whose lives you could actually observe. Now it's infinite. An infinite comparison against a curated, filtered, highlight reel version of other people's financial lives does something very specific to how you perceive your own. It makes real progress invisible.
Here's where it gets precise. Because this isn't just a vague cultural pressure. There's a specific psychological process driving it. Your brain has a baseline, a set point, a default sense of how okay things feel. And that baseline doesn't stay fixed, it adjusts. When your circumstances improve, when you get a raise or move somewhere nicer, or hit a financial milestone you'd been working toward, there's a brief period of satisfaction, of things feeling better. And then the expectation recalibrates. The new salary becomes the expected salary. The nicer apartment becomes just your apartment. The milestone becomes the floor, not the peak. And you find yourself standing in exactly the same emotional place you were before you got the thing you wanted, except now the thing you want is bigger. This is automatic. It's not weakness. Every human brain does this. It's thought to be adaptive, in the sense that staying satisfied with what you have might have reduced your drive to pursue more, which in earlier environments was dangerous. The brain that stayed restless was the brain that survived. But here's the part that matters for your financial life specifically. The baseline doesn't just shift with your own circumstances, it shifts with your reference group, the people you compare yourself to. And that reference group, crucially, is not fixed, it expands as your life expands. So the loop works like this. You observe something, a colleague's new car, a friend's home renovation, a LinkedIn post from someone you went to university with who has just done something impressive, a photo that shows what looks like a very comfortable, very well-managed life. Your brain processes this not as neutral information, but as evidence about where you stand, about whether you're keeping up, about whether the way you're living is consistent with who you believe yourself to be. And if there's a gap, if the evidence suggests you're behind, even slightly, what follows is not a clear thought, it's a feeling, a subtle, uncomfortable contraction, a quiet sense that something is off, that you're not quite where you should be. That feeling then shapes behavior. Maybe you mentally justify a purchase you'd been holding off on, because on some level you need to bring your visible life back into alignment with your sense of self. Maybe you feel a surge of anxiety that you can't quite attach to anything specific, just a background noise that your financial situation is more precarious than the numbers actually suggest. Or maybe you just feel flat, like you're working hard, staying responsible, doing the right things, and it isn't producing the feeling you were told it would. That flatness is the mechanism. You're running, the treadmill is moving, and you're not getting anywhere you can feel. This is where the pattern lives, but the full weight of what it actually costs you, that shows up much later.
Let's make this concrete, because this doesn't live in dramatic moments. It lives in the ordinary ones, the daily, mundane, quietly loaded decisions that don't feel like comparison traps when you're making them. Think about the last time you attended something, a dinner, a gathering, a work event, where you spent time in other people's homes, or heard about their vacations, or picked up on the rough shape of how they were living. You came home and the evening felt slightly off. You couldn't say why. Maybe you looked around your own place with different eyes. Maybe you lay awake for a while, running loose numbers in your head, not because anything bad had happened, but because the comparison had been made, and it landed somewhere uncomfortable. That's the mechanism at work. Unremarkable, familiar. Or consider the experience of getting a meaningful raise, Not a small one, a real one. The kind you worked toward that felt significant when it was confirmed. You were genuinely pleased for a few days, maybe a week. And then, quietly, without any deliberate decision being made, your spending adjusted. Not recklessly, reasonably. You just lived a little more in line with what felt appropriate for someone earning what you now earn. And within a few months, the raise had largely disappeared into the new normal. You were right back to wondering whether you were saving enough. That's expectation creep. Completely ordinary. Most people experience this repeatedly across their working lives and never quite name it. Or think about the particular discomfort of scrolling through your phone when you're tired, late evening. You're not looking for anything, but you pass through images of other people's lives, travel, renovations, celebrations, milestones, and by the time you put the phone down, the quiet satisfaction you might have felt an hour ago has been replaced by something smaller, a vague sense of falling behind, of others moving forward while you're standing still. You didn't consciously think, I am now comparing myself to others and feeling inadequate. It was subtler, just a low-grade shift in the emotional weather. Invisible and immediate. Here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. When was the last time you felt financially okay, truly, quietly okay, without placing what you have next to what someone else has? Not hopeful, not on track, not almost there, just at peace with it on its own terms. For a lot of people, the honest answer is harder to find than it should be. And there's one more manifestation I want to name, because it's the quietest one and possibly the most costly. It's the way comparison shapes not just what you want, but what feels socially necessary, what feels like a reasonable baseline for someone in your position. The neighborhood that fits your bracket, the schools, the car that doesn't require explanation, the vacations that feel appropriate, the social life calibrated to the people around you. None of these feel like keeping up. They feel like reasonable expectations, like just living your life. But many of them are quietly downstream of reference expansion, of an internalized image of what financial competence looks like at your stage. And staying aligned with that image costs money, consistently, invisibly, year after year, without a single moment that feels like a mistake. Here's where this gets expensive, and harder to see clearly, because in the short term, this pattern is largely invisible. You're not making catastrophic decisions. You're not gambling or spending money you don't have or making choices that would alarm a reasonable observer. Everything looks from the outside perfectly normal. The cost is structural, and it accumulates in the gap between what you could have built and what you did build, between the freedom that was technically within reach and the low-grade anxiety that persisted anyway. Let's look at what that gap actually looks like. The first thing that happens is that your real savings, the discretionary surplus that builds over time and eventually buys freedom, stays perpetually smaller than your income growth would predict, not because you're irresponsible, because the emotional recalibration has been moving with your earnings, because each upgrade in circumstance has been absorbed into normal. And so the question of whether you're saving enough is always present, even as your income climbs, because enough is always being defined against something external that keeps shifting. This creates a specific kind of anxiety, not the acute anxiety of real financial trouble, something more diffuse and harder to address, a background sense that despite working hard, despite earning well, despite doing the things you're supposed to do, you're not actually secure, that the ground beneath you is less solid than it appears. And you carry that for years, often without naming it or connecting it to anything specific, because it never quite rises to the level of a crisis.
It's just the texture of your financial life, the way it feels to be a responsible adult in your 40s. Now let's look at the freedom cost, because this one is harder to see. It exists in the future you didn't quite reach. People talk about financial independence as though it's a purely mathematical concept, a number, a date. But for most people caught in this pattern, the math was never really the obstacle. The obstacle was that the spending floor kept rising with income. The reference group kept expanding. The feeling of, I'll feel okay when I get to X, kept relocating, forward, always forward, just out of reach. And so the financial independence state, whatever version of freedom it represented, kept moving too, not dramatically, just quietly. A few more years, a slightly larger number, a slightly later horizon. That compounding of deferred peace, of persistent low-grade anxiety, of freedom perpetually almost within reach is the real cost of this pattern. Not any single bad decision, not any catastrophic mistake, just the slow, unremarkable erosion of enough. There's a particular kind of regret that comes from this too. It's not the sharp regret of a specific bad call. It's the softer, stranger kind, where you look back over a decade of reasonable, defensible choices and realize that somewhere in the accumulation of all those sensible choices, something got away from you. You were always going to feel financially okay once things settled down, once you'd gotten a bit further, once things looked more like they were supposed to look. And you kept working toward it, and it kept not arriving.
I want to offer 5 statements. Not questions exactly, just observations. Let them land however they land. When your income increases, you notice that within a relatively short time, it no longer feels like an increase. It just feels like what you earn. There are categories of spending in your life that you describe as choices, free choices, made on your own terms, but if you're honest, walking them back would feel less like saving money and more like falling behind. You sometimes feel more financially unsettled after periods of social activity, gatherings, events, time spent around people broadly in your world than you do after quiet stretches alone. You know rationally that your financial situation is not dire. You might even know that by certain measures it's quite good, but that knowledge doesn't seem to produce the sense of security that you'd expect it to. The last time you felt genuinely at peace with your financial life, not hopeful, not on track, but actually at peace, you might have to think back further than feels comfortable. These are not accusations, they're descriptions, and if several of them describe your experience, that's not coincidence, it's a pattern. And patterns, once you can see their shape, look different than they did before.
Here's what happens when you can actually see this. Not everything, but something real. When you notice the comparison happening in real time as you're scrolling or sitting at a dinner table or running numbers in your head late at night, you are no longer inside the mechanism. You are watching it. And there is a meaningful difference between being pulled by a current and being able to see the current. The current is still there, the pull is still real, but you have something you didn't have an hour ago, a name for what's happening. When expectation creep sets in, when a raise or a milestone gets absorbed into normal faster than you expected, you can recognize that for what it is. Not evidence that you need more, not proof that you're behind, just the brain doing what brains do, adjusting, recalibrating, running its default comparison without your consent. When the social comparison lands, when you come home from something and that quiet flatness settles in. You can notice that too, without needing to act on it immediately, without letting it become the measure of whether you're okay. Naming a thing creates distance from it, and distance in this context is not detachment, it's not indifference, it's the ability to look at a feeling and ask honestly whether it's telling you something true or whether it's a reflex, a comparison, a reference shift. You've likely been operating inside this mechanism for years. Most people do. It's not visible from the inside. It just feels like your financial life, like the texture of how money works for someone at your stage. But it has a shape, and now you can see it. That's not a small thing.
There's a version of financial security that has nothing to do with earning more, or having more, or reaching a number that finally feels sufficient. It has to do with being able to look at what you have without immediately placing it next to what someone else has, without the comparison running automatically, without letting the gap, if there is one, become the whole story. That version of security is harder to measure. It doesn't show up in any account balance, but it's recognizable when it's present, and it's equally recognizable when it isn't. If this gave you something to sit with, a clearer picture of what's been running quietly in the background, I'd be curious which part felt most familiar. Not what to do about it, just what you recognized. Leave it in the comments if you want. You probably won't be the only one.